There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a city when it starts to change. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of replacement, of one version of a place slowly being overwritten by another. If you have spent any real time in San Francisco, you know the feeling. You walk a block you have walked 100 times, and something is different. A door that used to open doesn't anymore. A face you recognized behind a counter is gone. A corner that once smelled like roasting garlic and espresso now smells like nothing at all. It is not dramatic. It is not sudden. It is the kind of shift you almost miss if you are not paying close attention. San Francisco has always been a city that reinvents itself. That is part of what makes it extraordinary. It survived the earthquake of 1906, the Great Depression, the Summer of Love, the AIDS crisis, and the dot-com crash. It has been home to gold rush prospectors, longshoremen, beat poets, civil rights activists, and Silicon Valley engineers, sometimes all at once, sometimes in painful conflict with each other. Change is stitched into the city's identity the way fog is stitched into its mornings. But something feels different now. Longer-term residents describe it as something more than change. They describe a kind of subtraction, not transformation in the way the city has always transformed, but a quiet hollowing out, the departure of the things that made San Francisco unlike anywhere else in America. What is left behind is expensive, polished, and strangely empty. And the people who are noticing it most are the ones who have been here long enough to remember what used to be there. Today we are going to look at 12 signs that San Francisco is losing what made it special. These are not abstract statistics. They are patterns that show up in neighborhoods, in schools, in storefronts, in the faces of families who stayed as long as they could before finally having to go. Each one tells part of a story. Together, they tell the full picture of what is quietly happening to one of the most iconic cities in the world. Sign number 12. The population is still shrinking, and the people leaving are not strangers. Between 2019 and 2023, San Francisco lost roughly 34,000 residents, placing it among the 4 counties in the entire United States with the largest population declines during that period, alongside Los Angeles, Cook County in Illinois, and Baltimore. Then, in 2024, the city lost another 3,000 people, making it the largest percentage decline of any of California's 10 biggest cities in that year. The current population sits around 842,000, approximately 30,000 fewer than the city's pre-pandemic peak. These are not people who were passing through. These are families who had put down roots, teachers who built careers, service workers who had navigated the housing market for years to stay close to the jobs and neighborhoods they knew. When people leave a city they love, it is rarely because they wanted to. It is usually because the math stopped working. The rent went up. The school didn't feel the same. The neighborhood where they raised their kids started feeling foreign. At some point, the calculation tipped, and staying became harder than going. What makes this particular exodus unusual is its geography. While San Francisco lost population at a steeper rate than any other county in the Bay Area, the inland counties grew. Sacramento County expanded nearly 5% over the same period. Contra Costa grew by 2.5%. Solano grew almost 3%. The same people who left the city didn't disappear. They drove east, further from the bay, further from the fog and the hills and the culture they came from, to places where the rent made sense and the schools were still open. And here's the sign inside the sign. The people who can always leave, the ones with savings, remote jobs, financial flexibility, left first and in the largest numbers. What that tends to do over time is hollow out the middle. Not the very wealthy, who can absorb any cost. Not the very poor, who are caught in the systems and structures that prevent them from going anywhere. But everyone in between. The teachers, the plumbers, the graphic designers, the restaurant managers, the small landlords. The people who form the connective tissue of any functioning city. When they go, something hard to name goes with them. Sign number 11. Downtown San Francisco became a different kind of place, and the recovery is slow and uneven. Before the pandemic, roughly 470,000 people commuted into downtown San Francisco every single workday. That number is from the city's own data. Those commuters were the reason the coffee shops opened at 6 in the morning. They were the reason the lunch counters turned tables 4 times between noon and 2. They were the reason Union Square felt alive on a Tuesday in February. And then, almost overnight, they stopped coming. The office vacancy rate in downtown San Francisco, which sat at a historic low of about 4.7% in the second quarter of 2019, climbed to nearly 37% by the end of 2024. The highest vacancy rate in the city's recorded history, and among the highest of any major American city. More than 1 in 3 office floors in downtown San Francisco was sitting empty. The financial impact was enormous. Property values fell. Tax revenues dropped. The small businesses that had depended on foot traffic, the sandwich counters, the dry cleaners, the shoe shine stands, the flower vendors, had no customers to serve. Some recovery has begun, driven largely by artificial intelligence companies relocating and expanding. The vacancy rate dropped to around 35% by mid-2025. The first real sustained decline since before the pandemic. AI firms leased over 1 million square feet of new office space in the city since late 2024. And real estate analysts are cautiously optimistic. But optimism about a commercial real estate metric does not automatically translate into the human texture of a neighborhood. Even at its most improved, downtown San Francisco still has more than 1/3 of its office space sitting dark. The storefronts that closed during those years do not automatically reopen because a lease gets signed upstairs. What long-term residents notice is not the vacancy rate. It is the restaurants that never came back, the dry cleaner that sold its equipment and retired, the lunch spot that ran for 30 years before the pandemic and simply never reopened. Recovery in commercial real estate is measured in square footage. The loss of a neighborhood's character is measured in something that does not show up on any spreadsheet. Sign number 10, Union Square. Once the city's retail and cultural heart became something no one expected. There was a time when Union Square was one of the great shopping districts in the American West. Department stores, flagship boutiques, theater marquees, tourists from Japan and Germany and Brazil moving through the streets with bags and coffee cups. Nordstrom anchored the Westfield Mall on 5th and Market for 35 years before closing in August 2023, citing what the company called a dramatic change in downtown market dynamics. When Nordstrom left, the mall's operator, a partnership between Westfield and Brookfield, surrendered the keys to the building's lender rather than continue operating it. Then came Bloomingdale's. After nearly 2 decades at the San Francisco center, the store confirmed its closure in January 2025, laying off 164 employees. It was the brand's second largest location in the country. After it closed in the spring of 2025, no Bloomingdale's remained in San Francisco. The nearest stores were in Palo Alto and Santa Clara. Macy's flagship Union Square location also announced plans to close. Michael Kors posted a closing sign in its San Francisco center storefront within weeks of Bloomingdale's announcement. Rolex, Bucherer, and Panerai pulled out of the mall in quick succession. Earlier departures included Nordstrom, Saks Off 5th, Adidas, Hollister, J. Crew, Lucky Brand, The Lego Store, The North Face, Burberry, L'Occitane, American Eagle, and Sephora. A list that reads not like retail attrition, but like a coordinated retreat. What replaced them, in many cases, was nothing. Empty storefronts with white paper in the windows. Security guards standing in front of locked doors. The kind of vacancy that signals not a temporary transition, but an unresolved question about what this place is supposed to be. For people who grew up going to Union Square, who took their kids to the Nordstrom on a Saturday, who bought a graduation dress at Bloomingdale's, who met friends under the big clock. The emptiness is not just economic. It is personal. It is the erasure of a ritual, And the city has yet to answer the question of what a Union Square without anchor stores actually is. Sign number 9. The cost of simply existing in San Francisco priced out the kind of people who made it interesting. To comfortably afford the median one-bedroom rent in San Francisco in 2025, which sits somewhere between $3,000 and $3,500 per month, depending on the source and neighborhood, a renter would need to earn roughly $120,000 a year. Not to save, not to invest, just to rent a one-bedroom apartment without spending more than 30% of their income on housing. The median home price in the city exceeds $1.2 million. In Pacific Heights, it goes far beyond that. The cost of living overall is 65% higher than the national average. Housing in particular is 161% more expensive than the national average. Groceries cost 21% more. Utilities cost 58% more. Transportation costs 43% more. These are not marginal differences. They represent a fundamental restructuring of who can afford to live in San Francisco and who cannot. What this does, gradually and then all at once, is transform the city's social composition. The teacher who loved the outer sunset but couldn't justify paying $3,000 a month for a one-bedroom apartment on a San Francisco unified salary eventually goes to Oakland, or Sacramento, or Portland. The artist who could have rented a studio in the Mission for $800 in 1999 cannot find anything comparable now at any price. The young couple who came to San Francisco with ambition and a willingness to live small discovers that even living small costs more than they can sustain on two moderate incomes. They leave, and the city loses the friction and creativity that comes from people of different backgrounds, living in close proximity, making things, taking risks, building something. What tends to remain are two poles: the people whose income is high enough to absorb any price, and the people whose circumstances make it impossible to leave. The middle, the musicians, the teachers, the cooks, the plumbers, the nurses who weren't nurses at a prestigious UCSF facility, but at a community clinic. The middle quietly empties out. And a city without a middle loses its soul before it loses its skyline. Sign number 8. San Francisco's public schools are in a quiet crisis, and the children leaving tell the story better than any budget document. The San Francisco Unified School District currently enrolls around 48,000 students, a number that represents a decline of thousands from just a few years ago, and a trend that projections suggest will continue, with the district expected to lose another 4,000 students by 2032. A system built to serve a larger, more populated city is now operating with a structural deficit that reached a projected $421 million. The district has already made over $114 million in cuts and must find another $113 million for the 2025-2026 school year. The superintendent described the coming cuts as painful. Proposals under consideration have included eliminating health and wellness programs at middle schools, reducing support for English language learners, cutting social workers, and slashing services for students from low-income backgrounds. In early 2024, the district's leadership announced that San Francisco would need fewer schools, a phrase that was carefully chosen to avoid the word closure, but meant exactly that. In a city where the birth rate is declining and families with children are leaving faster than new families are arriving, falling enrollment is not a temporary condition. It is a structural reflection of who can afford to raise a family inside San Francisco's borders. When families with school-age children represent a shrinking portion of the population, the city changes in fundamental ways. It becomes less oriented toward the long term, less invested in community institutions, less connected to the idea that a city has an obligation not just to its current residents, but to the next generation. For families who are still there, the cuts are not abstractions. They are a music teacher who no longer comes on Wednesdays, a counselor who used to be available but is now shared with 3 other schools, a program that helped a kid with dyslexia stay on grade level until the funding was eliminated. These are the losses that don't make news cycles. But they add up in ways that eventually prompt a family to start looking at real estate in the East Bay. Sign number 7. The Mission District, one of the city's most culturally vivid neighborhoods, has been pulled in directions that few of its longtime residents chose. The Mission District was, for generations, the heart of San Francisco's Latino community. It was the neighborhood where families who came from Mexico and Central America built something enduring. Taquerias that had been in the same family for 3 decades. Panaderias that opened before sunrise to have fresh bread ready. Social clubs, community centers, murals that covered entire building walls with images of labor, migration, and belonging. The neighborhood's main commercial corridor along Mission Street and the side streets around 24th and Valencia was not just a shopping district. It was a living cultural document. The dot-com boom of the late 1990s brought the first serious wave of displacement, pressure, as tech workers moved into the neighborhood and rents began to climb. The second wave came harder. A 2-bedroom apartment that rented for around $800 in 1999 had, within 15 years, become a property where landlords were attempting to cash out at values that could only be supported by tenants earning far above the median income. The result was displacement at a scale that reshaped the neighborhood. What the Mission looks like today is more complicated than a simple before and after story. There are still taquerias on Mission Street. La Taqueria on 24th Street still serves burritos that have won national recognition. The murals are still there, though some have been painted over and replaced. But the density of Latino-owned small businesses has thinned. The community institutions that once made the Mission a self-sufficient cultural world, the community newspapers, the social halls, the affordable SRO hotels that housed single working adults, have contracted. The neighborhood has not been erased, but it has been edited. And the edit was not done by the people who built it. Sign number 6. The Fillmore District carries a wound that has never fully healed, and each new wave of change reopens it. There are few stories in San Francisco's history more painful than what happened to the Fillmore. In the 1940s, as thousands of African Americans migrated from the Jim Crow South to work in the Bay Area's wartime shipyards, many settled in the Western Addition and Fillmore neighborhoods. They built something extraordinary. The neighborhood was nicknamed the Harlem of the West. And the comparison was serious, not metaphorical. At its peak, the Fillmore had 29 jazz clubs and supper clubs. It had more than 180 businesses. Musicians like Louis Armstrong, Ella Fitzgerald, T-Bone Walker, and John Coltrane performed on Fillmore Street. It was a thriving, self-sustaining community at the center of Black cultural life on the West Coast. Then came what the city called urban renewal, starting in the 1950s and accelerating through the 1960s and 1970s. San Francisco's redevelopment agency demolished 883 businesses, nearly all of the jazz clubs, and displaced 4,729 households from the Western Addition. The families who lost their homes and businesses were predominantly Black. The blocks that were leveled sat as empty lots for years before anything was built. The community did not recover. By 2020, only about 6,000 Black residents remained in the Fillmore neighborhood, representing about 12% of the population, down from roughly 22,000 Black residents in the 1970s, who had made up nearly 60% of the neighborhood. Today, if you walk down Fillmore Street, you will find high-priced restaurants, boutiques, and condominium towers. In the pavement of the Jazz Preservation District, there are markers commemorating businesses that used to exist there. One of them marks the former location of a woman's jazz club, Leola King's Birdcage, at 1505 Fillmore. The building where it once stood is now a Starbucks on the ground floor of a condominium tower. The marker is in the concrete below where customers walk to pick up their mobile orders. Sign number 5. The city's homeless crisis is not just a policy failure. It is a visible daily reality that reveals how the city's promises have frayed for its most vulnerable residents. More than 8,300 people in San Francisco are homeless today. Nearly half of them are unsheltered, living in cars, tents, or on sidewalks. The Tenderloin, a dense neighborhood of about 50 blocks just west of Union Square, is where the crisis is most visible. Tech workers who work at companies like Uber and others headquartered near Market Street walk past encampments on the way into work. The contrast is so stark, so normalized by repetition, that many longtime observers describe it as something no functioning society should simply accept as part of the urban scenery. San Francisco spends more per homeless resident than almost any other American city. The district spends around $27,000 per student in its schools, which is 45% higher than peer districts, and per capita spending on homelessness has grown significantly as well. And yet the visible crisis has not meaningfully diminished. Some of that is because homelessness is not a single problem with a single solution. It is the convergence of housing costs, mental health systems that were defunded decades ago, addiction without adequate treatment infrastructure, and the absence of the kind of low-cost housing stock. The SROs, the boarding houses, the accessible rentals that once absorbed people before they fell all the way to the street. The experience of walking through the Tenderloin or along certain blocks of Market Street is not unique to hardened residents. Families visiting from other cities describe the shock. People who have returned to San Francisco after years away describe feeling that something has slipped beyond what they recognized. It is not a new problem. San Francisco has struggled with it for decades. But the scale and visibility of it today reflects the accumulated failures of a housing market that squeezed out everyone who couldn't compete at the top. Sign number 4. San Francisco's black population has been leaving for 50 years, and the city's response has been largely symbolic. In 1970, African Americans made up 13.4% of San Francisco's population. By 2010, it was 6.1%. Today, it is less than 5%. The city that once housed roughly 100,000 black residents now holds a black population the size of a mid-sized university. The Fillmore story is part of it, but so is the compounding pressure of tech-driven housing costs. The erosion of historically black neighborhoods in Bayview-Hunters Point as development pressure increased, and the absence of economic structures that made it possible for black families to accumulate wealth in a city where they had so consistently been displaced. The descendants of the families who built the Harlem of the West are now, as one observer put it, scattered as far as Antioch and Sacramento. The street signs in the Fillmore's Jazz Preservation District commemorate their contributions. The neighborhoods where they lived and worked have been transformed into real estate that few of them could afford to return to, even if they wanted to. And the city has largely addressed this history with markers in pavement, occasional hearings at City Hall, and the kind of language about reparations and equity that does not change what a one-bedroom apartment costs on Fillmore Street today. Sign number 3. The small businesses that gave San Francisco its neighborhood character are being squeezed from every direction. San Francisco has always been a city of neighborhoods. The Richmond, the Sunset, Noe Valley, the Castro, Hayes Valley, Bernal Heights, each with its own commercial strip, its own pocket of local shops, its own identity. The small pharmacies, the family-owned hardware stores, the independent bookshops, the bakeries that had been there since the neighborhood was built. What gave those corridors meaning was not the presence of any single store but the density of them. The sense that when you walked down a block, you were walking through something that belonged to the people who lived there. Peter Lowe has owned Wellman's Pharmacy in San Francisco since 1987. He describes the pressure on independent pharmacies with specific clarity. Declining reimbursement rates from insurance companies, competition from national chains that can absorb losses, and the structural impossibility of competing on price with companies that exist at an entirely different scale. His situation is not unique. It is being replicated across the city, in shoe stores, fabric shops, small grocery stores, neighborhood hardware stores. The businesses that made it through the pandemic often found that their commercial rent had been renegotiated upward when the lease expired, erasing the margin that had allowed them to survive. The city's Office of the Comptroller reported in May 2025 that about 230 businesses per month were opening in San Francisco, a sign of genuine entrepreneurial energy. But the mix was shifting. Restaurants and bars were opening. National brand operators were returning to corridors that had been vacated. What was not returning were the locally owned specialty businesses, the shoe repair shops, the independent pharmacies, the tailors, the neighborhood grocers, the kind of businesses that form the economic foundation of a community rather than its entertainment layer. In the Richmond and Sunset districts, immigrant-owned businesses that had served their communities for decades found themselves vulnerable to exactly the kind of displacement that rezoning proposals were threatening to accelerate. Food and beverage businesses with higher concentrations of minority ownership were among the most exposed. The corridors that felt like neighborhood institutions were, in many cases, sitting on leases that could be restructured at any moment. Sign number 2. The city's identity as a place of counterculture and creative freedom is becoming a museum exhibit of itself. The intersection of Haight and Ashbury streets is still there. The Victorian houses are still painted in their elaborate colors. Amoeba Music, the legendary record shop on Haight Street, is still open. But the neighborhood that was the center of the American counterculture in 1967, the Summer of Love, the Grateful Dead performing in the park, Janis Joplin living a few blocks away, Allen Ginsberg reading in coffee houses, is now a neighborhood where the burning question, as one longtime resident once described it, is whether a Whole Foods should be allowed to open nearby. The Haight has become, in the most precise sense, a heritage site. It markets its own history to tourists who come to take photos at the intersection and buy tie-dyed t-shirts. The counterculture that once lived there is now commemorated in a formal counterculture museum, which opened in 2025, charging general admission to see what was once happening on every street corner for free. The spirit of defiant creativity that produced the music, the politics, the communal experiments, the genuine rupture with the mainstream. That spirit did not survive the combination of rising property values and the conversion of the neighborhood's rebel identity into a tourism product. The Castro district went through a parallel transformation. Harvey Milk's camera shop on Castro Street is long gone. The neighborhood that was the center of the LGBTQ rights movement in the 1970s, a place where people came when they had nowhere else to go, where community was built under genuine threat, is now one of the most expensive residential neighborhoods in an already expensive city. The Castro Theater still stands and still hosts screenings, but the community infrastructure that made the Castro a refuge, the affordable housing, the social organizations, the accessibility for people without high incomes, has been under sustained pressure for 2 decades. What happens to a city when its countercultural neighborhoods become their own theme parks? When the places where people once came to escape convention become the most conventionally expensive addresses in the zip code? San Francisco has not yet fully answered that question. But the residents who were there for the original thing describe looking at what it has become with a mixture of pride and grief. That is hard to put into words. Sign number 1. The city's soul, the thing that made people from all over the world want to come here, is being redefined by an economy that has room for the very rich and the very poor, but very little for everyone else. What made San Francisco different, at its best, was the combination. The proximity of people from different backgrounds, different beliefs, different income levels and generations and cultures, all sharing a small, geographically contained place of extraordinary natural beauty. You could be a longshoreman and live 3 blocks from a novelist, and 2 blocks from a family that had emigrated from Guangdong province, and around the corner from a jazz musician, and down the hill from a software engineer. The city worked, when it worked, because it held contradictions together rather than sorting everyone into their economic tier. That version of San Francisco required affordable housing. It required small businesses that hired people without college degrees. It required public schools that were worth staying for. It required streets that people of all incomes could move through without encountering scenes that made them feel the city had given up on the idea of a shared public life. It required the political will to believe that a city's value is measured not in its property values, but in its capacity to hold a full range of human experience. Between 2022 and 2023, Bay Area tech companies headquartered in San Francisco and its surrounding region, cut more than 46,000 jobs. Salesforce alone cut 8,000 employees in January 2023. Amazon, Meta, Google, Cisco, and dozens of smaller firms followed. For the people who lost those jobs, many had built their lives around the assumption that San Francisco would always need them. Their mortgage calculations had been made on the assumption of continued employment. Their children were enrolled in schools. Their spouses had taken jobs, built careers, put down deposits. The layoffs arrived quickly, and the support infrastructure for navigating them in a city this expensive was thin. What San Francisco is becoming is not necessarily bad in every respect. The AI industry is bringing new investment, new leases, new energy to a downtown that was genuinely struggling. Some neighborhoods outside the downtown core are showing real resilience, with new businesses opening and communities holding together. The natural beauty has not gone anywhere. The fog still rolls in from the Pacific in the late afternoon and covers the hills and makes the city look the way it always has. But the pattern of the last several years points toward a city that is becoming something more narrow than what it was. A city defined more by its most expensive real estate and its most successful industry than by the full, messy, creative, conflicted community that made those industries want to be there in the first place. A city that is pricing out its teachers and its artists, and its immigrant families and its working-class neighborhoods, and its community pharmacists, and its longshoremen, and its jazz musicians, and is left with a cleaned-up version of itself. Beautiful and expensive and strangely quiet. Cities are built by everyone who lives in them. They accumulate meaning over generations. Every business that lasted 30 years, every family that stayed through hard times, every community institution that served people who had nowhere else to go. San Francisco has more of that accumulated meaning than almost any city in America. But accumulated meaning is not indestructible. It can be eroded by rising costs that price out the people who carry it. It can be erased by redevelopment that removes the physical places where it was held. It can be replaced by something shinier and more expensive that does not remember what came before. The question that longtime San Franciscans are living with right now is not whether the city will survive. It will. The question is which version of San Francisco survives. Whether the full, complicated, diverse, underpaid, creatively alive, sometimes difficult city that generations of people built with their lives and their labor, whether that city gets to persist, or whether it gets curated down to a luxury product that wears its history as decoration rather than carrying it as a living thing. The signs are already there. They are in the empty storefronts on Market Street. They are in the enrollment numbers at San Francisco Unified. They are in the concrete markers on Fillmore Street where jazz clubs used to be. They are in the faces of families who drove east with their belongings and didn't look back because looking back was too painful. San Francisco is not the first great American city to face these pressures, and it will not be the last, which makes the next question not just about San Francisco, but about every American city that is watching from a distance, thinking it could not happen to them.